Welcome back, everybody, to Duffy's Outdoors and episode 3 of our Folklore and Stories series. Today's episode, we will cover the legend and folklore of what some know as the skinwalker. Stick with us as we dive into the mystery and reports of this mysterious entity. Find and follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook under the handle Duffy's Outdoors. Let's get at it. Out in the American Southwest, among the Navajo people, there exists a legend that has been passed down for generations. They speak of something they call a skinwalker. According to their tradition, a skinwalker is not simply a creature, but a person who has taken on something else entirely, something that can move between forms, something that can imitate, not just appearance, but sound, voice, and familiarity. It's said that skinwalkers were once human, but chose to cross a line into something darker, gaining the ability to move through the wilderness unnoticed, to observe people, to follow them, sometimes even to call out them in voices they recognize. In Navajo culture, these stories are treated with seriousness and respect. They are not told casually, and they are not considered fiction in the way most people think of folklore. What's unsettling is that, over time, stories with striking similarities have appeared far beyond the desert lands where that legend began. Here, in the legends of the Appalachian Mountains, people didn't grow up using the word skinwalker. Most had never even heard it. Not because they hadn't experienced something they couldn't explain, but because in these mountains, there has always been an understanding that some things are better left unnamed. All throughout Appalachia, from the coalfields of eastern Kentucky to the ridges of West Virginia, to the remote hollows tucked deep into western North Carolina, there have been stories passed quietly between people who trust each other. Stories about hearing someone call for help when no one was there. Stories about seeing someone standing just beyond the reach of light, watching, waiting, and sometimes calling out again. Tonight's story comes from one of those mountains. The exact location isn't important, because what happened there has been described in places all across the Appalachian region. The encounter took place during a late fall scouting trip somewhere in the central Appalachian Mountains, in an area that had once been heavily strip-mined many years before. Like a lot of those old sites scattered across eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, and southern West Virginia, the land had long since been abandoned and left to slowly reclaim itself. Grass had grown back in uneven patches, and small trees had begun creeping in along the edges. But the terrain still held the shape of what it had been, a wide, flattened expanse sitting high above the surrounding forest with steep drops into the hollows on all sides. He had walked up there that afternoon following an old access road that miners used decades ago. It was quiet in the way those places often are, where even the wind seems to move differently across open ground than it does through the trees. He had spent a couple of hours moving slowly along the ridge, looking for deer sign, not really thinking about anything beyond the normal rhythm of being alone in the woods. At some point, he realized the light was starting to fade faster than he expected. The sun had already slipped behind the higher ridges in the distance, and what remained of the daylight had turned into that dim, gray-blue haze that flattens everything and makes distance harder to judge. He knew he needed to start heading back down before it got fully dark, so he turned and began walking across the open field toward the access road. He was about halfway across when he heard the voice. It was clear enough that he stopped immediately, certain at first that it had to be another person. It sounded like a man calling out from somewhere behind him, not yelling, not panicked, just a normal speaking voice. "Hey, can you help me?" He turned around right away, expecting to see someone walking up from the lower road or standing somewhere out in the open field. But there was nothing there. The ground stretched out behind him for several hundred yards, nothing but grass and the darkening outline of the ridge. He stood still, listening, thinking maybe he had misjudged the direction. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind moving across the open ground. Then the voice came again. Same tone, same volume. "Hey, can you help me?" He said that was the moment when the situation stopped feeling normal. It wasn't just the words, it was how controlled it sounded, how evenly it carried across the distance. Whoever it belonged to didn't sound injured, didn't sound out of breath. There was no movement accompanying it, no sound of footsteps, no shifting brush, nothing to indicate something was actually walking towards him. He began scanning the edge of the field more carefully, letting his eyes follow the tree line where the open ground ended and the forest began again. That's when he saw the silhouette. It was standing near the edge of the woods, partially framed by the last remaining light in the sky behind it. At that distance, and with the light fading as quickly as it was, he couldn't make out details. He couldn't see a face or clothing. He could only see the outline of a human shape standing upright, completely still, as if it had been there longer than he'd realized. He waited for it to move, expecting that once he had spotted it, the person would step forward or raise a hand or call out again. But it didn't. It remained exactly where it was, motionless against the darkening tree line. He remembers thinking how strange it was that someone would ask for help and then make no effort to approach. The distance between them was too far for a normal conversation. Anyone needing assistance would have closed that distance quickly. Instead, it simply stood there, watching him. He never heard the voice again after that. He stayed where he was for another few seconds, trying to convince himself there was a reasonable explanation. That it was another hunter? That the fading light was making things harder to see clearly. But the longer he stood there, the stronger the feeling grew that he wasn't looking at someone who needed help. He was looking at something that wanted him to come closer. The realization was enough. He slowly turned away and began walking back toward the access road, forcing himself to move at a steady pace, even though every instinct he had was telling him to get out of there as fast as possible. He said he could feel it behind him the entire time, even though he never turned around to confirm it was still there. It wasn't until he reached the cover of the trees and started down the road that he allowed himself to look back. By then, the field was empty. There was nothing standing at the edge of the woods, nothing moving across the open ground, no voice calling after him, just the wind. For a long time, he told himself there had to be a simple explanation. Another hunter, someone passing through, someone who had left before he noticed. That's what he wanted to believe. But the more he thought about it, the more certain details refused to make sense. He had spent enough time in those mountains to understand how sound behaves in open country. Voices carry, but they also change. They rise and fall naturally with distance and movement. What he had heard that evening never changed. It had sounded exactly the same both times, as if it had been spoken from a fixed point, without breath, without effort. And more than that, he couldn't shake the image of the silhouette itself. It hadn't moved closer, hadn't waved, hadn't done any of the small, unconscious things people do when they're standing in one place. It had simply stood there, as if it didn't need to move at all. In the weeks that followed, he mentioned the experience to a few people he trusted. Not many, just enough to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. Most didn't say much in response, but one older man he knew listened quietly, and then nodded in a way that suggested he wasn't surprised. The man told him there were places in the mountains where people had always heard things they couldn't explain, places where voices carried when no one was there, places where figures had been standing at the edge of clearings, watching from the safety of shadow. He didn't offer an explanation, just a warning that sometimes the worst thing you could do in those situations was answer back. Stories like that aren't limited to one ridge or one strip mine. Across Appalachia, similar accounts have surfaced for generations, often told reluctantly and almost always with the same uncertainty. In southwest Virginia, a pair of hunters walking along an old logging road near dusk reported someone calling out behind them using one of their names. Both men turned, expecting to see their partner trailing behind, only to realize they were still standing shoulder to shoulder. The voice had come from deeper in the woods, in a direction neither of them had traveled that day. In the mountains of western North Carolina, a backpacker described hearing what sounded like a woman calling for help somewhere below the trail he was hiking. The terrain there dropped sharply into a steep hollow filled with thick laurel, making it nearly impossible for someone to move through quietly. He listened for several minutes, waiting to hear movement, but none ever came. When he finally left the area, he said the voice had simply stopped. Even in eastern Tennessee, there have been reports from former mining sites where people working alone at dusk claim to see figures standing along the edges of reclaimed land. Too far away to identify, visible only for a few seconds at a time, gone by the time anyone looked twice. In nearly every case, the details differ slightly, but the pattern remains the same. A voice, a figure, and the overwhelming feeling that whatever was there was yearning for a connection. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth. Long before towns were built here, before roads cut through the ridges, before the forests were interrupted by mines and logging trails, these mountains stood on their own. People who have lived here long enough understand that the land holds onto its secrets. Most of the time, those secrets remain exactly where they belong. But every so often, someone has an experience they can't explain, a moment where something doesn't behave the way it should, where a voice comes from a place that should be empty, where a figure stands just far enough away to never be fully seen. Some have tried to connect those experiences to older legends from other parts of the country, stories like the Navajo skinwalker, which speak of something capable of imitation, something capable of learning human behavior well enough to repeat it. Others believe it may be something else entirely, something that has always been there, something that doesn't need a name. Whatever the explanation may be, the man who stood on that strip mine ridge never went back alone. He still spends time in the mountains, still hunts, still walks the same kinds of trails he always has, but he leaves those open ridges well before dark now. Because he knows there are places in Appalachia where the distance between you and something watching may be far shorter than you think. This has been Duffy's Outdoors, and if you find yourself in the mountains at dusk and you hear a voice calling from somewhere it shouldn't be, take a moment to listen carefully and consider whether it's something you should answer.